You know, I was thinking about this the other day. Usually when we talk about a medical diagnosis, right there is this expectation of clinical precision.
Yeah, like a very binary black and white reality.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You go to the hospital with a broken arm, they put you in the x-ray machine, the film comes up with that jagged white line, and the doctor just points at it.
Right there it is.
Eh,
Broken.
Yeah, broken, it's clean, it's visible, and honestly, I think it's incredibly comforting in a weird way. We love when our problems can be categorized and isolated and just physically pointed to.
Well, it's comforting because we can see it,
Yeah.
you know? If you can see the problem, you feel like you can fix it.
Exactly. Welcome to Reformed Thinking, by the way. Today, we are taking all of that comfort, all of that desire for a clean, visible diagnosis, and we are just throwing it completely out the window.
Because the moment you step into the world of human nature, the moment you try to diagnose our moral and spiritual condition, that x-ray machine is totally useless.
It really is. We are looking at a diagnostic landscape that is entirely invisible to the naked eye.
And that creates this ultimate diagnostic crisis for humanity.
Yeah.
We are terrified of what we can't see. So we just project the disease onto things we can see.
Yes.
We assume the sickness is out there, in the air, in the culture, in a zip code or our environment.
Which brings us directly to our mission for this deep dive today. We are looking at a massive theological collision centered on just 3 short verses in the Gospel of Mark. Mark chapter 7, verses 14 through 16.
And I know what you're probably thinking out there listening to this. Spending an entire session on 3 verses might sound like we're pulling out the theological tweezers.
Right, like we're getting way too into the weeds.
Yeah, but the commentaries and the historical sources we're unpacking today make a really compelling case that this isn't just a localized ancient squabble about hand-washing.
No, not at all. What happens in these 3 verses is really a revolutionary paradigm-shifting diagnosis of the entire human condition. Jesus completely dismantles what the sources argue is the most pervasive delusion in human history.
I love that word delusion for this, because it really anchors the whole conversation. The persistent assumption across almost every human culture is that our primary spiritual or moral sickness comes from our environment.
We genuinely believe our defilement is external.
We really do. We think the problem is the media we consume, or the politicians in charge, or the neighborhood we grew up in, or, the toxic people in our friend group.
Right, the underlying assumption there is that if we could just perfectly curate our environment, our souls would naturally just achieve this state of peace and purity.
And think about the sheer amount of energy we expend on this as a society.
Oh, it's wild. We buy these elaborate organizational systems to declutter our homes, right? Hoping it will declutter our mind.
We go on digital detoxes.
We meticulously engineer our diets. We unfollow people on social media who bring quote-unquote bad vibes. We are just obsessed with sanitizing the outside of the cup.
And, it makes total sense on a human level. External things are measurable.
Right, you can check a diet off a list. You can block a phone number.
Yeah, exactly. But the theological framework we're looking at today argues that this approach is basically like treating a systemic terminal blood infection by putting a shiny new Band-Aid on your forearm.
Oh, wow, yeah.
You are fundamentally misunderstanding the location of the disease. And if you misdiagnose the location of the disease, well, your cure will inevitably kill a patient.
So what Jesus does in Mark 7 is he surgically removes that Band-Aid, and he forces humanity to look at the actual infection. But to really grasp the explosive nature of what he says here, we have to look at the immediate context.
Yeah, we need to set the scene. We are in first century Galilee, and this is an absolute powder keg moment in his ministry.
Let's talk about that tension because it is palpable. Just prior to this moment in Mark's timeline, Jesus is operating at an absolute fever pitch of popularity.
Oh, yeah. He's just fed the 5,000. He's walked on water.
When he lands in Gennesaret, the crowds are so frantic they are practically swarming him. They're begging just to touch the fringe of his garment to be healed. I mean, he is a rock star in Galilee at this point.
Which is exactly what triggers the religious establishment.
Yeah.
You have this rogue, unsanctioned Galilean preacher accumulating massive cultural capital without running it through the proper institutional channels.
Right, he didn't get the right permits.
Exactly. So Mark tells us that a delegation of Pharisees and scribes comes down from Jerusalem. And the sources really emphasize that we need to recognize the gravity of that journey.
Yeah, Jerusalem to the Sea of Galilee, that's not a short trip.
No, it's roughly a 70-mile journey through difficult terrain. They aren't taking a casual weekend stroll to hear a good sermon.
This is an official audit by the Supreme Religious Council, the Sanhedrin.
Precisely. They are the theological elite, the guardians of orthodoxy, and they have marched all the way north to investigate, audit, and ultimately discredit this movement.
They need to find a flaw. They need to prove to the masses that Jesus is a fraud who doesn't respect the traditions of the elders.
And the flashpoint they choose to attack him on is so fascinating.
It really is, because they don't attack his miracles. I mean, it's pretty hard to argue with a previously blind guy who is now staring you right in the face.
Right, you can't really debate a healed leper.
Yeah, and they don't even attack his core theology of God. They attack his disciples for eating bread with unwashed hands.
Right. Mark notes that they notice the disciples are eating with defiled or, quote, common hands.
Now, I have to be honest here. When I first read this as a modern reader, my initial reaction was a bit sympathetic to the Pharisees.
Oh, really? How so?
Well, I mean, didn't God give Israel a massive, incredibly detailed purity code in the Old Testament? If you slog through the book of Leviticus, it is just wall-to-wall laws about what is clean and unclean, how to wash, what not to touch.
That's very extensive.
So why is Jesus getting so hostile toward these men who are ostensibly just trying to take God's holiness seriously? It feels a bit like getting mad at a germaphobe for using hand sanitizer, you know?
That is a completely fair question. And honestly, it's exactly the defense the Pharisees would have mounted for themselves. But the historical context reveals this massive distortion that had taken place over centuries.
Okay, walk me through that.
Yeah.
Because we have to differentiate between the written law of Moses given at Sinai and what they call the tradition of the elders, right?
Exactly. To understand the Pharisees, you really have to understand the trauma of the Babylonian exile. Back in 586 BC, Jerusalem was destroyed. The temple was burned, and the Jews were dragged off to Babylon.
Right, an incredibly traumatic national event.
And why did it happen? Because they had repeatedly broken the laws of God, specifically regarding idolatry and Sabbath keeping. So when they finally returned from exile decades later, there was this collective terrified consensus.
Like a national PTSD almost.
Yes. They basically said we can never ever let that happen again. So they started building what the rabbis literally called a fence around the Torah.
Okay, a fence around the Torah. What did that look like in practice?
The logic was simple. If God says don't walk on the grass, we will make a rule that says don't even walk on the sidewalk next to the grass.
I see. So if you never break our extra rules, you'll never even come close to breaking God's actual rule.
Exactly. Over the centuries, specifically during those 400 silent years between the Old and New Testaments, these oral traditions just multiplied. They became this massive, suffocating labyrinth of behavioral codes.
So returning to the hand-washing issue, the written law in Leviticus did have strict ceremonial purity requirements, but those were mostly for the priests, right? Like the sons of Aaron?
Yes, perfectly stated. If you were an Aaronite priest about to enter the actual tabernacle to offer a blood sacrifice to the holy God of Israel, you absolutely had to undergo rigorous ceremonial washing.
Right. It was a vivid picture of the purity required to approach Yahweh.
But the Pharisees had taken those priestly temple-specific rituals and arrogantly forced them onto the shoulders of everyday laymen who were just eating domestic meals in their own homes.
That is a staggering yoke to put on a normal population. They essentially mandated that a fisherman in Capernaum eating a piece of bread with his family had to maintain the exact same ritual purity as the high priest on the Day of Atonement.
It's completely absurd. And by the time we get to the first century, these oral traditions are viewed as having equal, if not greater, authority than the written scriptures.
Wow.
Later, these oral laws would be codified in the Mishnah. And there are entire massive tractates in the Mishnah dedicated solely to this. There is one called Yadeim, which literally means hands detailing exactly how water must be poured.
And we really need to emphasize for you, the modern listener, that this has absolutely zero to do with hygiene. Right? The Pharisees didn't know about germ theory. They weren't trying to prevent an outbreak of salmonella here.
Not at all. This was a highly mystical ceremonial ritual. The fear was that if you walked through the public marketplace, the agora, you might accidentally brush up against a Gentile.
Right, or touch a piece of pottery that a Gentile had touched an hour ago.
Because Gentiles were outside the covenant, they were considered inherently ceremonially unclean. So that contact would render you common or profane.
It's like spiritual radiation. You don't know if you've been exposed, but if you have, it completely contaminates your soul.
Precisely. So before you could put a piece of bread into your mouth, you had to perform this ritual washing to cleanse the spiritual contamination of the secular world. And the rules were absurdly specific.
How specific are we talking?
Well, you needed a minimum amount of water, about a quarter of a log, which is roughly an eggshell and a half full.
An eggshell and a half? Wow.
Yes. and it had to be poured over the hands exactly up to the wrist. If the water didn't cover the entire hand, or if you used water that had previously been used for work, the ritual was totally invalid.
Oh, man.
If you ate without doing this perfectly, the Pharisees believed you were just as guilty as someone who slept with a prostitute.
Imagine the psychological terror of living under that system. You would wake up every single day just paralyzed by the fear that you might accidentally bump into a Roman soldier in the market, fail to pour the water past your knuckles at lunch, and suddenly find yourself entirely cut off from the grace of God.
It's a system designed to breed chronic spiritual anxiety. And that anxiety is highly profitable for the religious elite because it makes them the indispensable gatekeepers of salvation.
Right, you have to keep going to them to make sure you're doing it right. But Jesus exposes the absolute moral bankruptcy of this system right before he addresses the crowd.
He does. He points out that while they are obsessing over a few drops of water on their wrists, they are actively violating the Ten Commandments.
Yes, the Corbin loophole. I love that the historical commentaries we're using focus on this because it perfectly illustrates the utter depravity of their system.
It is a masterclass in religious evasion.
Break down how the Corbin rule actually functioned for us.
It is brilliantly sinister. So the fifth commandment, written in stone by the finger of God, says, honor your father and your mother. In an ancient agrarian society without pension plans or social security, honoring your parents practically meant providing for them when they became too old to work.
Right. It was a financial and moral obligation to care for your aging parents.
But the Pharisees had a workaround.
A very lucrative workaround, it sounds like.
Oh, absolutely. They created a tradition called Corbin, which translates to a gift dedicated to God.
Let's say a man has aging parents who can no longer afford food. They come to their son and ask for help. Under God's law, he is obligated to care for them.
But under the tradition of the elders, what could he do?
The son could simply point to his bank account, his crops, or his property, and declare it Corbin. He formally dedicates it to the temple.
So he says, sorry, Mom and Dad, I would love to buy you groceries, but all my assets belong to God now. My hands are tied by my incredible piety. Exactly. He weaponizes religion to commit elder abuse. But here is the truly devious part. Declaring something Corbin didn't mean you actually had to liquidate your assets and hand them over to the priests right then and there.
Wait, really?
Yeah, it was essentially a religious trust fund. The man could continue to live in the house, eat the crops, and enjoy his wealth for the rest of his life. He just couldn't use it to help his parents because it was technically God's property.
That is just sick. So they are actively starving their own mothers and fathers, blatantly violating the moral law of the universe, all while patting themselves on the back for being so intensely devoted to the temple.
It is a staggering level of hypocrisy. They look like the holiest men in Israel on the outside, and on the inside, they are ruthless, greedy sociopaths.
Which is exactly why Jesus quotes the prophet Isaiah directly to their faces. He says, "This people honors me with their lips, but their heart is far from me in vain. Do they worship me, teaching as doctrines the commandments of men?"
He is taking a sledgehammer to the foundation of their entire religious enterprise right there. He is publicly declaring that their authority is completely illegitimate.
Which sets up this massive theological earthquake. But before we get to the actual words Jesus speaks to the crowd, we really need to pause and look at how Mark actually structured this story in his gospel.
Yeah, Mark's literary arrangement is crucial here.
Because Mark is a brilliant literary architect. He doesn't just throw stories together chronologically, he arranges them to make a profound theological point. Why does Mark put this highly specific debate about hand washing right here in the middle of all these massive miracles?
That's a great observation.
Yeah.
If you look at the macro structure of Mark's gospel leading up to this, it's all about establishing the unassailable divine authority of Jesus Christ. Just prior to this, he exerts authority over nature by multiplying bread and fish.
Right.
Then he walks on the raging waters of the Sea of Galilee. And remember what he says to the disciples in the boat when they think he's a ghost? He says, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid."
And in the Greek, that it is I is ego eimi. It's the Greek translation of the divine name revealed to Moses at the burning bush, the great I am.
Precisely. Jesus is not acting as a rabbi arguing over a footnote in the Mishnah. He is acting as the sovereign Lord of the covenant. He's the author of the law. And armed with that absolute divine authority, Mark structures chapter 7 into 3 distinct movements addressing 3 distinct audiences.
Right, let's break those down. First, you have verses 1 through 13. This is the polemical confrontation. Jesus is face to face with the Sanhedrin delegation, tearing down their hypocritical Corban traditions and totally invalidating their ecclesiastical authority.
He essentially dismisses the prosecuting attorneys right there.
Yeah, he just brushes them aside. Then he turns his attention away from the elites. This brings us to verses 14 through 16, which is the public decree. He calls the common crowd to himself and delivers a universal axiomatic truth about human nature.
And finally, the third movement in verses 17 through 23, Jesus leaves the public square, goes into a house privately with his disciples, and has to explicitly spell out the terrifying implications of what he just said because they are completely baffled by it.
But the true genius of Mark's arrangement isn't just the 3 audiences, it's what happens immediately after this theological discourse. If you follow Jesus' itinerary right after the fire, he declares that all this external ritual washing is useless. Where does he go?
He leaves Galilee entirely. He intentionally walks straight into pagan Gentile territory. He travels to the region of Tyre and Sidon.
And the very first person he ministers to in that region is a Syrophoenician woman, a Canaanite, the absolute epitome of a ceremonially unclean outside the covenant Gentile.
Right.
And shortly after that, he goes to the Decapolis, another predominantly Gentile region, and performs a miracle mirroring the feeding of the 5,000, but this time feeding 4,000 Gentiles.
To really understand the gravity of that itinerary, we have to recognize what those purity laws actually functioned as in the ancient world. They weren't just a personal spiritual discipline.
No, they were much more than that.
They were a sociological border wall. The Pharisees utilized the dietary restrictions and the hand-washing rituals as a massive, impenetrable keep-out sign for the rest of humanity.
Think about the sociology of a meal in the ancient Near East. Sharing a table with someone, breaking bread with them, was an intimate act of fellowship and acceptance. It was saying, we are family, we are at peace.
Yeah, it was a covenantal act almost.
Exactly. But the Pharisaic purity laws made it literally impossible for a Jew to ever sit at a table with a Gentile. If a Gentile cooked the food, it was unclean. If a Gentile touched the plate, it was unclean.
The religious system fundamentally mandated segregation. It fostered an intense spiritual xenophobia. A Pharisee couldn't evangelize a Roman or a Greek because he couldn't even enter their house without becoming defiled.
So when Jesus stands up in Mark 7 and publicly declares that external things cannot defile the human soul, he isn't just dropping a theological fun fact. He is detonating the border wall.
Oh yeah, brick by brick.
He is dismantling the theological architecture that kept Jews and Gentiles segregated. He is laying down the prerequisite runway for the Great Commission.
Without this specific teaching, the early Christian church would have remained a tiny, isolated Jewish sect in Jerusalem. Think about the Apostle Peter. Mark's gospel is heavily influenced by Peter's first-hand accounts. And Peter was deeply, deeply entrenched in this worldview.
Oh, totally. Fast forward to the book of Acts, chapter 10. Jesus has already ascended. The Holy Spirit has fallen at Pentecost. And Peter is up on a roof in Joppa praying. He gets this vision of a sheet coming down from heaven filled with all these non-kosher, unclean animals, reptiles, pigs, you name it.
And a voice from heaven says, "Rise, Peter, kill and eat."
And Peter's response is incredibly telling. He says, "By no means, Lord, for I have never eaten anything that is common or unclean." Even after following Jesus for 3 years, the ingrained conditioning of that Pharisaic fence was still gripping his conscience.
But then the voice from heaven issues the ultimate correction. What God has made clean, do not call common, is the exact same theological vocabulary from Mark 7.
And the purpose of that vision wasn't just to update Peter's diet. It was to prepare him for the knock on the door downstairs. Men sent by Cornelius, a Roman centurion, an uncircumcised Gentile, were waiting for him.
Because Jesus had already established the theology of internal purity over external ritual back in Galilee. Peter is finally able to walk down those stairs, travel to Caesarea, walk into a Gentile home, and preach the gospel.
It is stunning. The theological dominoes that fall because of Mark 7 are what ultimately brought the gospel to the entire non-Jewish world. It proves that membership in the family of God is not about your ethnic pedigree, your highly curated diet, or your meticulous hand-washing. It is entirely about the state of your heart before a holy God.
Which brings us to the actual mechanics of what Jesus says to the crowd to establish this new reality. The Greek exegesis of verse 14 in our sources is incredibly rich. Mark writes, "And calling the crowd to him again, he said to them,
I love how the grammatical scholars break this down because a casual reading in English completely misses the power dynamic here. Talk to me about that word calling.
The Greek verb used there is proskalesemenos. The crucial detail is that it's in the middle voice. In Greek grammar, the active voice means the subject is doing the action to someone else. The passive voice means the action is being done to the subject.
Right.
But the middle voice implies that the subject is acting in a way that intimately involves themselves or draws the action back to their own interest.
So this isn't a substitute teacher clapping his hands trying to get a rowdy classroom to pay attention.
Not at all. It is the language of a sovereign, summoning his subjects into his royal jurisdiction. He is actively, authoritatively drawing the multitude into his own personal presence. He has just dismissed the illegitimate authority of the Sanhedrin, and now he is pulling the common people, the ones who have been crushed and extorted by these man-made laws, for generations directly to himself.
And once he has them in his jurisdiction, he issues a double imperative. He doesn't offer a suggestion. He says, "Hear me, all of you, and understand."
The verbs are accusat and senet. Accusat demands immediate, decisive auditory obedience. And notice the object, hear me. He doesn't say hear the consensus of the scholars or let's review the traditions.
Yeah, he bypasses every intermediary and places his own word as the ultimate authority.
It reminds me so much of the famous Shema from Deuteronomy 6. Hear, O Israel. The Lord our God, the Lord is one.
The theological commentators draw a direct parallel here. Jesus is adopting the posture of Yahweh addressing the covenant community. He isn't asking them to passively consume content. He's demanding total cognitive and spiritual submission.
Because the second imperative senet means to synthesize, to comprehend, to bring the pieces together in your mind. He knows that what he is about to say is going to completely short-circuit their theological hardwiring. They're going to need to exert immense mental effort to grasp it.
And then he drops the hammer. Verse 15, the absolute core of the passage. There is nothing outside a person that by going into him can defile him. Let's pause and dissect that word defile because I find the linguistic warfare happening here to be brilliant. Jesus takes the Pharisees' favorite weapon and turns it back on them.
Yes, he does. The Greek word he chooses to use is kuinou, which means to make common, profane, or unholy. Now, the significance is really found in the words he deliberately avoided using.
What do you mean?
Well, if he wanted to talk about physical dirt, he could have used a word like miano, which implies a physical stain or getting muddy.
But he doesn't. He uses the highly technical theological term.
Exactly. Koinu was the exact word the Pharisees weaponized to oppress the population. They walked through the markets pointing at people, declaring, you are koinos, you are common. You are profane because you didn't wash your hands correctly.
Jesus takes their exact theological terminology, completely neuters it of its external power, and reassigns its meaning.
It's brilliant.
The first half of this axiom is a masterclass in ontology, the nature of being. There is nothing outside the man going into him which is able to defile him. The scholars highlight the word dynatai, which speaks of inherent power or native capacity.
Jesus is stating an immovable ontological fact here. Physical matter has zero native capacity to corrupt an immortal soul.
It's an issue of categories. Dust, unwashed hands, a piece of non-kosher meat, a speck of dirt from a Gentile marketplace. These are physical molecular compounds. They belong to the material realm.
Right.
The human soul, the conscience, your moral standing before a holy God that is the spiritual realm. Physical matter cannot reach across that dimensional boundary and stain a spiritual soul. It's just impossible.
And Jesus makes this point with shocking earthy bluntness when he contrained us. He explains it privately to the disciples a few verses later. They were struggling to understand. So he breaks it down to basic biology.
Right, he really spells it out for them.
He says, look, when you eat food with unwashed hands, where does it go? It goes into your stomach, the digestive system breaks it down, and it is eliminated into the latrine.
The Greek word is aphedrona, literally the toilet, the sewer.
It is a remarkably graphic way to make a theological point, but it's incredibly effective. He's saying, you religious elites are building your entire moral universe around the biological process of digestion. Digestion ends in the sewer. It has absolutely zero bearing on your spiritual state.
You are obsessing over the toilet while your souls are rotting.
Exactly.
I love that. He completely demystifies the physical world. He frees the human conscience from the tyranny of superstitious man-made rules. Your environment, the physical objects you touch, the unwashed hands, they cannot make you a sinner.
But, and this is the massive terrifying, but of this entire passage, if the outside world cannot make us sinners, why is the world so incredibly broken?
Yeah, why is there so much violence, greed, and hatred? If we can't blame our environment, who do we blame?
This leads to the second half of verse 15, the devastating diagnosis. Jesus uses a strong adversative clause. But the things coming out of a person are the things that defile him.
The sickness isn't out there, it's in here.
The grammatical construction here is vital. The Greek uses a continuous present tense participle ekporiomena. It means proceeding out, continuously erupting, without end.
This is a profound shift in how we view human nature. The human heart isn't just a neutral container. It's not an empty jar that occasionally gets bumped by bad circumstances and spills a little bit of sin.
No, it is an active, continuous, erupting fountain of moral pollution. The heart is a factory of defilement.
Jesus spells this out in terrifying detail in verses 21 and 22. He lists a catalog of 13 specific vices. Listen to this grim inventory. For from within, out of the heart of man, come evil thoughts, sexual immorality, theft, murder, adultery, coveting, wickedness, deceit, sensuality, envy, slander, pride, foolishness.
13 distinct, horrific manifestations of evil. And he prefaces the entire list with a statement of origin from within.
We really need to define our terms here because when modern Western people hear the word heart, we immediately think of a Hallmark card.
Yeah, we think of emotions, romance, sentimental feelings.
The culture tells us to follow your heart, assuming that deep down our truest, most authentic desires are inherently good and beautiful.
But the biblical anthropology operating here is completely different.
Entirely different. In the biblical worldview, the Greek word kardios, which translates the Old Testament Hebrew word leb, has almost nothing to do with mere sentimentality.
What does it mean then? The heart is the command center of human existence. It is the seat of the intellect, the volition, the will, and moral agency. It is the cockpit of the soul. It is the very core of who you are as a conscious being.
So when Jesus says the heart is the source of murder, deceit, and pride, he isn't just saying we occasionally suffer from bad emotional impulses. He is saying the very engine of our decision-making, the core of our reasoning and desires, is fundamentally corrupt.
The compass itself is broken and pointing toward rebellion.
The historical theologians we're reading summarize this profound diagnosis with the doctrine of total depravity. And it is crucial that we understand what that term actually means because it is frequently caricatured.
The theological analysts refer back to the Westminster Confession, specifically chapter 6, which provides a masterclass in defining this biblical reality.
Yes, let's unpack total depravity because it sounds like we are saying every human being is as absolutely demonic and evil as they could possibly be at every single moment of the day. But that's not what the doctrine teaches, is it?
Not at all. That would be absolute depravity. Total depravity doesn't mean extensive in degree. It means extensive in scope. The confession uses the precise phrase that humanity is wholly defiled in all the faculties and parts of soul and body.
It's an issue of pervasive contamination. A great way to visualize this is to imagine a clear glass of water. If I take a single dropper of blue food coloring and squeeze it into the glass, the water doesn't become a solid block of blue dye right away.
Right.
But as you watch it swirl, there is not a single molecule of water in that glass that isn't eventually tinted by the blue dye.
That is a perfect analogy. The fall of man in Eden was the drop of dye. There is no part of our human nature, our mind, our will, our physical desires, our emotions that remains a pure, untouched sanctuary of pristine goodness. Everything is tainted by sin.
We are not born as a tabula rasa, a blank slate, waiting for society to write either good or bad things upon us.
No, we are born indigenous to sin. We have a natural, inherent bent toward self-worship, pride, and rebellion against God's authority.
It is a completely devastating diagnosis. It strips away every ounce of moral superiority. It shatters the delusion that I am basically a good person who just occasionally makes mistakes because I'm stressed out.
Yeah, it's a hard truth to swallow.
But this brings us to a massive pivot point in our deep dive today. The implications of this diagnosis do not stay locked in the first century. The theological and philosophical sources we are synthesizing today make a very aggressive, direct application to modern society.
They really do.
If Jesus' diagnosis of the human heart is fundamentally universally true, then it completely obliterates the foundation of almost every modern ideological system attempting to fix the world today.
This is where the rubber meets the road.
Yeah.
And as we explore this, we want to carefully chart the arguments and critiques leveled by our theological sources against various modern worldviews. We're just reporting what the sources argue here.
Right, we are just unpacking their analysis.
The central argument in these texts is that secular society, regardless of where it falls on the political spectrum, gets the human condition catastrophically wrong, precisely because it denies this doctrine of internal defilement.
Let's look at their critique of structuralism or secular sociology. The commentators take direct aim at modern systems like liberal humanism and more contemporary frameworks like critical race theory.
Right.
Now, the fundamental premise of these secular systems, according to the theological critique we're reading, is the assumption of human neutrality or inherent goodness.
Yes, the secular doctrine basically preaches that man is inherently good. Therefore, if a man commits a crime, if a society exhibits systemic racism, if there is greed or injustice, it cannot be because the humans involved are fundamentally evil.
So what's the secular explanation then?
Well, it must be because the system failed them, the environment poisoned them, the historical superstructure oppressed them.
So the logic follows, if the disease is external, the cure must be external. If we can just re-engineer society, change the laws, dismantle the oppressive hierarchies, redistribute the wealth, and adequately fund the education system, then the human heart will naturally blossom into perfect harmony, equity, and righteousness.
But the sources argue that Jesus' teaching in Mark 7 exposes that entire sociological framework as a utopian fantasy. Jesus says emphatically the structural environment does not defile the man. The filthy human heart defiles the man.
The root problem with society isn't primarily systemic, it's spiritual. The systems are corrupt because the individuals building the systems have corrupt hearts.
Exactly.
Now, I can hear the objections to this already, so let's explore the tension. Common sense and basic observation tell us that environment does matter.
Sure, of course it does.
A child growing up in a loving, stable, two-parent home with financial security is generally going to have a different trajectory than a child growing up in a chaotic, abusive environment surrounded by crime. We cannot deny that a bad environment makes things worse. How do the theologians reconcile Jesus' words with the undeniable impact of trauma and environment?
They reconcile it through a brilliant clarification of mechanism. They don't deny that environment has a profound impact, but they use a vivid analogy to explain how it impacts us.
Let's hear it.
They compare human nature to a sponge. Imagine you have a sponge soaking in a bucket of filthy, toxic water. Now imagine you take that sponge out of the bucket and you squeeze it in your hand. What happens?
Dirty, toxic water pours out everywhere.
Exactly. Now here is the crucial question. Did your hand squeezing the sponge create the dirty water?
No. The squeezing just forced out what the sponge had already absorbed. It revealed what was already residing on the inside.
That is the biblical view of environment according to the sources. They argue that difficult circumstances, poverty, historical oppression, trauma, a toxic upbringing, those things act as the hand that squeezes the sponge. They put immense crushing pressure on the human soul.
But they do not create the sin.
No, the pressure only draws out the sin, the fear, the anger, the malice, and the pride that was already dwelling latently inside our fallen nature.
Wow. The squeezed sponge. That is an incredibly helpful paradigm. A terrible environment might exacerbate the symptoms, it might accelerate the decay, but it is not the genesis of the disease. The root cause remains internal.
Therefore, attempting to fix humanity purely through external social engineering programs is, as one commentator perfectly phrased it, like meticulously painting the outside of a rotting house while the foundation is literally collapsing into dust.
It might look aesthetically pleasing on the outside for a brief moment, but the structure is fundamentally doomed. You cannot legislate a new heart.
And it is vital to note that this critique isn't just lobbed at secular politics by our sources.
Oh, definitely not.
The authors of our sources are equally unsparing when they point this text directly at the church itself. Religious externalism is just as guilty of denying Mark 7 as secular sociology.
Absolutely. The commentaries specifically identify theological systems that rely on external rituals to solve internal problems. They call out Roman Catholic sacramentalism, specifically the doctrine of ex opere operato.
Let's define that term for the listener. What does ex opere mean mechanically?
It's Latin for from the work performed. It is the theological belief that the sacraments of the church, like water baptism or the Eucharist, actually infuse justifying grace into a person's soul simply by the physical act being correctly administered regardless of the internal faith of the recipient.
And the theological critique here is that this is a direct continuation of the Pharisaic error. It is trusting a physical external element, in this case baptismal water or communion bread, to accomplish an internal spiritual cleansing.
It is the exact ontological category error Jesus just condemned. Physical water cannot wash a spiritual soul, whether it's poured from a Pharisee's pitcher or a priest's baptismal font.
And Protestant fundamentalism does not escape the crosshairs either. The sources aggressively critique conservative legalistic churches that operate on a behavioral modification model.
Oh, I know these churches well. This is the community that measures a person's entire spiritual standing by what they don't do. They don't drink alcohol, they don't smoke, they don't watch R-rated movies, they follow a strict dress code.
Right. And you can have a congregation full of people who perfectly execute all of those external traditional rules. Their outward cups are polished to a blinding shine.
But internally,
Internally, the congregation is absolutely consumed with malicious gossip, spiritual pride, racial prejudice, and secret envy.
they successfully built a new fence around the Torah, but they left the heart completely untouched. And Jesus says those internal sins, the pride, the gossip, those are the things that actually render you profane before the judgment seat of God. Not the movie you watched, but the pride you harbored.
Synthesizing all of this, the core argument in these texts is undeniable, whether it is a progressive socio-political movement trying to fix the system or a conservative religious institution trying to enforce moralism. Any attempt to justify or cure humanity from the outside in is a total denial of Christ's fundamental diagnosis.
It is treating the symptom while the patient dies of the disease.
Exactly.
Which brings us to the ultimate terrifying question of this entire deep dive.
Hmm.
If the disease is total depravity, if my heart is a continuous factory of moral pollution, if no amount of political reform, social engineering, or religious ritual can clean me, then how is there any hope?
Yeah, it feels pretty bleak.
If I am incapable of cleaning myself from the inside out, who can?
That is where the text points us to the Christological cure. The sources draw our attention heavily to verse 16. It is a solemn, deeply prophetic warning. Jesus says, "If anyone has ears to hear, let him hear."
Now let's address the elephant in the room for anyone reading along in a modern translation of the Bible right now. In many contemporary versions, verse 16 is either put in brackets or it's missing entirely from the main text and relegated to a tiny footnote at the bottom of the page. Why is that?
It's a fascinating issue of textual criticism. Verse 16 is absent from a few of the earliest Alexandrian Greek manuscripts, specifically the Codex Sinaiticus and Codex Vaticanus from the 4th century.
Oh, okay.
Because of that absence, some modern textual scholars hypothesize that a later scribe inserted it here because it was a phrase Jesus used so frequently elsewhere. However, it is overwhelmingly present in the Byzantine textual tradition, which makes up the vast majority of all surviving historical manuscripts.
But regardless of the debate over whether Mark penned it in this exact paragraph or a scribe added it as a connective summary, the theology embedded in the phrase is undeniably authentic to Jesus. He says it constantly.
He really does. He uses it repeatedly in Mark 4, for instance. And the phrase itself is a direct echo of the prophetic call of the Old Testament, specifically Isaiah chapter 6 and Ezekiel chapter 3. Jesus is establishing a critical theological distinction between natural physical hearing and the sovereign gift of spiritual illumination.
Explain that distinction, because obviously everyone standing in that crowd had physical ears. They all heard the sound waves vibrating the air when Jesus spoke.
Right. Anyone with functional eardrums can hear the physical sound of Jesus declaring your heart is defiled. A secular historian can hear that. A Pharisee can hear that.
But hearing the data is not the same as receiving the truth.
Exactly. It requires a miracle of grace, a divine giving of spiritual ears for a fallen, depraved human being to actually internalize that terrifying truth, apply it to themselves, and confess, "He is right. I am entirely broken. I have no hope in my own righteousness. I need a Savior."
Without spiritual ears, a person hears the diagnosis of total depravity and gets violently offended. With spiritual ears, a person hears the diagnosis and falls to their knees in repentance.
That's beautifully put.
And that leads us to the breathtaking beauty of the incarnation. If every single human being born in the lineage of Adam inherits this corrupted, defiled nature, how can humanity ever be reconciled to a holy God? The answer is that God himself had to step into the timeline.
Jesus Christ is the only human being in the history of the world whose heart produced absolutely zero defilement.
The only clean man. I love how the theological sources frame that. It is such a powerful title. When you look at the internal life of Jesus of Nazareth, out of his heart flowed only perfect, unbroken love for the Father.
He possessed pure, unadulterated compassion for the broken and absolute burning zeal for righteousness.
There was no deceit hiding in the shadows of his mind. There was no covetousness when he looked at the wealth of Rome. There was no hidden pride when the crowds cheered for him. His internal fountain produced only living water.
And because he was perfectly, infinitely pure on the inside, watch what happens when he interacts with external impurity. The Gospel of Mark paints this beautiful recurring pattern. Jesus constantly, intentionally touches things that the Levitical law and the Pharisees said would instantly defile him.
He reaches out and touches the leper.
Yes.
He allows himself to be touched by the woman with the issue of blood, a woman who had been hemorrhaging and ceremonially unclean for 12 agonizing years.
Right.
He walks into the house of Jairus, takes the hand of a dead girl, and raises her. Touching a human corpse was the absolute pinnacle of impurity in the Old Testament law.
According to the Pharisaic tradition, the millisecond Jesus made physical contact with the leper, the bleeding woman, or the corpse, their impurity should have infected him. He should have been rendered profoundly koinos profane. But the flow of purity is miraculously reversed.
This is where the mechanisms of grace just blow my mind.
Jesus doesn't catch their defilement. His divine purity is contagious. He transmits life, healing, and unassailable cleansing to them. His holiness is not fragile. It doesn't need to be protected behind a fence of man-made rules.
It isn't defensive, it is aggressive, and it actively conquers pollution wherever it goes.
I think about how we view sickness today. Sickness is contagious. If I have the flu and I give you a hug, you might catch my flu. But if I'm perfectly healthy and I hug you while you have the flu, you don't catch my health.
Right. Health isn't communicable.
But Jesus is so radically, perfectly pure that his health infects the sick. His life infects the dead. His purity swallows up their defilement.
And that aggressive pattern of conquering impurity reaches its absolute cosmic climax at the cross. We established earlier that the Old Covenant ceremonial washings could only clean the outside of the flesh. They were pedagogical shadows, object lessons pointing to a deeper need. So how is the internal polluted human heart actually cleansed?
It requires the spotless lamb. On the cross, Jesus, the only clean man, willingly allows himself to be treated as the ultimate unclean thing. He is dragged outside the camp of the holy city. He is mocked, beaten, and crucified among common criminals.
And in that moment, all the things that Jesus listed back in Mark 7, the envy, the deceit, the slander, the pride, the hatred, the murder, the sheer filth that continuously erupts from our hearts, all of it converged onto him.
He took the internal spiritual filth of humanity upon his own shoulders. As the Apostle Paul writes in 2 Corinthians, "For our sake he made him to be sin who knew no sin, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God."
Jesus bore the full, unmitigated wrath of God against our inward depravity. His blood reaches the one place the water of the Pharisees could never penetrate, the human conscience.
And this ties everything perfectly into the New Covenant promises. The commentaries bring up the prophets Ezekiel and Jeremiah here. When God promised to save his people, he didn't promise to give them an updated list of better laws.
He didn't promise a more efficient system of external rituals either.
No, God promised a fundamental biological level spiritual transplant. Through Ezekiel, Yahweh says, "I will sprinkle clean water on you, and you shall be clean from all your uncleannesses. And I will give you a new heart, and a new spirit I will put within you. And I will remove the heart of stone from your flesh and give you a heart of flesh."
That is the beautiful biblical doctrine of regeneration. The ultimate solution to the human condition is not behavioral modification. It is not social engineering. It is regeneration.
It is the sovereign act of God granting an entirely new heart. And this is the absolute bedrock of solidified justification by faith alone.
You are not justified before God by meticulously cleaning up your act, perfectly curating your environment, or washing your hands in the exact right way.
You are justified solely by trusting in the alien righteousness of Christ, the one who cleanses the defiled heart and grants you a totally new nature.
It is the most devastating diagnosis of human ability and simultaneously the most hopeful, liberating message in the world.
It really is.
All right, we have covered a massive amount of historical and theological ground today. Let's start to summarize this journey. We began in the dusty, crowded markets of first-century Galilee, watching Jesus go toe-to-toe with the theological elites.
We saw how he completely neutralized their obsession with external purity, taking their own Pharisaic vocabulary of defilement and turning it inside out.
We explored the macro-level implications of that moment, how this single, incredibly tense conversation was the theological wrecking ball that shattered the ceremonial border wall.
It paved the necessary runway for Peter's vision in Acts 10, allowing the gospel to break out of its Jewish confines and reach the Gentile world.
And most importantly, we traced how Jesus permanently shifted the battleground of holiness. It is no longer about the dining table. It is no longer about the specific volume of water poured over the wrist or the socio-political environment we engineer.
The battleground is the human heart, a heart that is by nature a continuous factory of defilement, wholly dependent on the regenerating grace of God.
For you tuning in today, the practical application of this theology is profound, especially when it comes to progressive sanctification.
Yeah, the goal of the Christian life is not to build a brilliant facade. It is not to look impressively holy on the outside while secretly harboring lust envy or spiritual pride on the inside.
True holiness requires a ruthless honesty about the state of your own heart. It means dragging those hidden internal thoughts into the searing light of Scripture, confessing them without making excuses, and relying daily on the Holy Spirit to put them to death.
It means we have to stop blame shifting. We have to stop blaming our spouses, our bosses, our political opponents, or our childhood for our sinful reactions.
We have to take absolute ownership of the fact that the difficult circumstances only squeezed the sponge. The sin that poured out was entirely our own.
Which leaves us with a final provocative thought to mull over as we wrap up this deep dive.
Think about the sheer exhausting scale of human effort happening around the globe right now. We spend billions of dollars, we exhaust our mental health, and we burn countless hours of our brief lives desperately trying to sanitize our environments.
We hustle to buy homes in the right zip codes. We ruthlessly curate our media feeds to block out negative influences, and we meticulously construct an unblemished, perfectly filtered external image for the world to see.
Deep down, we desperately want to believe the illusion. We want to believe that if the outside is safe and clean, the inside will finally be at peace.
But what if the most terrifying yet ultimately liberating truth you could ever accept is that the call is coming from inside the house?
The sickness isn't out there, it's in here. And until you realize that you will never stop trying to wash your hands and you will never fall on your knees to ask the great physician for a new heart.
Amen to that.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive on Reformed thinking. Until next time, keep listening and keep searching the text.